"Don't touch that piano." Vivian Ashcroft snapped the moment she saw the repairman's hand resting on her father's keys. The grand hall went silent. Owen Callahan was nothing more than a single father hired to tune an old Steinway before an estate auction, and the instrument beneath his fingers was supposed to be untouchable, sacred, sealed inside the Ashcroft family's grief. But when Owen played the first 4 notes, the color drained from Vivian's face. It was the melody her father had carried to his grave, a song no one alive was supposed to know. And somehow, this stranger remembered the ending. If you believe there are stories where quiet kindness finally silences arrogance, stay until the last note falls, and consider following along for what comes next. The Ashcroft estate sat on 11 acres of manicured lawn overlooking the river, a stone mansion built in 1922 by a man who believed permanence could be purchased in granite and iron. On the morning of the auction preparation, the house had been stripped of its usual hush. Paintings were tagged with small white numbers. Grandfather clocks were wrapped in quilted blankets. Leather-bound books were boxed by the dozen, their spines facing outward like soldiers awaiting inspection. Every object that had once belonged to Reginald Ashcroft was being converted, piece by piece, into a line item on an auction house ledger. The air inside smelled of lemon oil and old paper, the particular scent of a house being prepared for strangers rather than lived in by a family. Sunlight fell in long gold bars through the tall east windows, catching the dust that drifted upward every time a mover shifted a crate or unrolled a length of packing felt. Somewhere upstairs, a radio played faintly, and the low murmur of appraisers moved from room to room like a tide going out, leaving behind only the bare outline of what had once been a life. Vivian had walked these halls 1,000 times as a girl, her footsteps echoing off the same marble now scuffed by dolly wheels and shipping crates. She had told herself, repeatedly, that selling the house was simply practical, that a company the size of Ashcroft Holdings could not afford sentiment, that her father himself would have approved of such a clean, efficient decision. She had almost convinced herself of it, too, until the morning arrived and the finality of it settled into her chest like a stone she could not put down. Owen arrived a little after 8 in the morning, driving a truck that had seen better decades. Its bed rattling with a canvas tool roll, felt hammers, tuning forks, and a stethoscope-thin listening tube he had owned since he was 23 years old. He wore a flannel shirt softened by 1,000 washes and boots that had been resoled more than once. He did not look like a man who belonged inside a house with marble floors, and he knew it, and it did not bother him. He had learned long ago that the value of his hands had nothing to do with the value of his clothes. The piano waiting for him in the grand hall was a 1928 Steinway, its case the color of dark honey, its lid closed like an eye that refused to open. Owen approached it the way he approached every instrument he had ever restored, with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with the price tag attached. He set his tools down gently, lifted the lid, and let his eyes travel across the keys the way another man might read a familiar face. Vivian entered the hall in the middle of that motion, dressed in charcoal gray, a folder of auction documents pressed against her side like armor. She had not slept well in 3 nights, not since the lawyers finalized the sale terms, not since she had agreed to let strangers walk through her father's house and decide what his life had been worth in dollars. Seeing an unfamiliar man leaning over the one object she had specifically asked to be handled last, and only by her, something in her simply broke open. "Don't touch that piano," she said again, louder this time, crossing the room in 6 sharp strides. "Who let you in here?" Owen straightened slowly, his hands raised just slightly, not in surrender but in respect. He explained calmly that the auction house had hired him to inspect the instrument's action and pin block before it could be listed, that pianos left untouched for years often hid cracked soundboards or swollen hammers that no photograph could reveal. Vivian barely heard the explanation. She heard only that a stranger had been allowed to lay hands on the last thing in the house that still smelled, faintly, like her father's cologne. Conrad Ashcroft appeared behind her a moment later, immaculate in a tailored suit, his silver hair combed with surgical precision. He took one look at Owen's canvas tool roll and made no effort to hide his contempt. He suggested, in the smooth voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that they replace this particular technician with someone from a more reputable firm, someone whose equipment did not look like it belonged in a garage sale. Owen did not argue. He had spent most of his adult life being underestimated by men like Conrad, and arguing had never once changed their minds. He simply began to close the lid, his palm flat against the polished wood, when something beneath the music rack caught the edge of his vision. A small engraving nearly invisible unless the light hit it just right. 4 notes, carved into the wood so long ago that the grain had softened around the edges. His breath caught. He had not seen that particular sequence in almost 20 years, and yet his fingers remembered it before his mind fully did. Without asking permission, without thinking about the woman glaring at him, or the man already reaching for his phone to call security, Owen sat down on the bench and let his hands find the keys. 4 notes rang out into the marble silence of the hall, soft and unhurried, the kind of phrase a man hums to himself when he believes no one else is listening. The sound seemed to fold the entire room backward through time. Vivian, who had been mid-sentence, stopped speaking entirely. Her folder slipped an inch in her grip. Whatever color remained in her face drained away until she looked, for just a moment, like a woman standing at the edge of a memory she had spent years trying to outrun. "Where?" she said, her voice suddenly small in a way it had not been in years. "Did you hear that?" The question hung in the air like dust caught in a shaft of light. Owen lifted his hands from the keys and folded them in his lap, unsure how much truth this room was prepared to hold. He looked at Vivian, really looked at her, and saw not the cold heiress from the tabloids, but a woman who had just heard a ghost speak in her father's voice. Behind her, Conrad's expression had shifted from irritation to something sharper, something that resembled fear dressed up as anger, though neither woman in the room noticed it yet. Owen told her, gently, that her father had called the piece "The House That Waited for You." He said it the way a man returns a keepsake he has kept safe for someone else for far too long. Vivian's reaction was immediate and fierce. She insisted there was no such composition, that every scrap of music her father had ever touched was catalogued, indexed, protected by the family's own archivists, and that nothing by that title existed in any drawer, vault, or hard drive belonging to the Ashcroft estate. She accused him, coldly, of having read some private detail somewhere and dressing it up as memory to extract money from a grieving family. Conrad seized the opening before Owen could respond. He snapped his fingers toward the hallway, summoning the estate's private security, and declared loudly that this man had likely stolen documents from Reginald years earlier, that his presence in the house was no accident, but the opening move of a long con finally being played out. 2 guards appeared in the archway, uncertain whether to approach. Owen did not flinch, and he did not run. He simply repeated, in the same even tone he used when explaining a broken hammer mechanism to a nervous client, that Reginald had never finished writing the piece down. The old man had played the ending for him once, late at night, and asked him to remember it, because paper could be lost and memory, if it belonged to the right person, could not. To prove it, Owen played a few more measures, his fingers moving with the unhurried certainty of someone reciting a prayer learned in childhood. Vivian's knees nearly buckled. The phrase he played was the exact melody her father used to hum. So quietly she was never sure if she had imagined it, standing just outside her closed bedroom door, when she was a girl too proud to let him in. That detail did not exist anywhere, not in a biography, not in a company profile, not in the meticulous employee records Conrad liked to reference whenever he needed to prove his own loyalty to the family. It lived only in the memory of a lonely child and, apparently, in the memory of a stranger with calloused hands and a truck that rattled. Eleanor Pike, the estate's longtime housekeeper, had been crossing the hall with a silver tray when the melody reached her, and the tray slipped from her fingers and clattered against the marble floor. Cups rolled in slow circles. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand pressed to her chest, staring at Owen as though she were seeing a photograph step out of its frame. She recognized him, she realized with a jolt, as the thin, quiet young man who used to arrive at the service entrance on certain evenings almost 2 decades ago, always after dark, always gone before morning. Conrad cut her off before she could say another word, dismissing her recollection as the fog of an aging mind, suggesting she had confused this stranger with someone else entirely. Eleanor did not argue with him aloud, but something in her eyes hardened, the particular stillness of a woman who has just decided to trust her own memory over a powerful man's convenient version of events. Vivian ordered Owen to stop playing, but she did not order the guards to remove him. Something in her, some old ache she had spent years bricking over with spreadsheets and board meetings, wanted to know why her father would have shared something so intimate with an outsider and never once with her. She asked him plainly, her voice cracking just slightly at the seam, why Reginald would give this melody to a man he barely knew instead of the daughter who had spent her whole life waiting for him to say something, anything, that sounded like love. Owen held her gaze without flinching, because he understood that the truth, however painful, was the only gift he had left to offer her. Because, he said quietly, he thought you would never let him say it out loud. The words landed like a struck chord that refused to fade. Vivian turned away first, walking toward the tall windows overlooking the garden, needing a moment where no one could watch her face rearrange itself. Conrad watched her retreat with visible unease, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking toward Owen with a calculation that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with control. Whatever this stranger knew, Conrad seemed to understand instantly. It was dangerous to him in ways the others in the room had not yet begun to guess. To understand how Owen came to know a melody no living Ashcroft had ever heard, the story had to travel back 18 years, to a city far from this marble hall, to a cold water apartment above a laundromat, where a scholarship student learned to survive on ambition and very little sleep. Owen had been accepted into a prestigious music conservatory in Boston on a partial scholarship, the kind of opportunity that arrived once in a lifetime and demanded everything a young man had in return. He spent his mornings in practice rooms with peeling paint, his afternoons in lecture halls memorizing theory, and his nights loading pianos onto delivery trucks for a moving company that paid just enough to keep the lights on. He was gifted, everyone agreed, but gifted was not the same as wealthy, and wealthy was what the conservatory's tuition truly required. His apartment that winter had a single radiator that clanked more than it warmed, and he often practiced silent fingerings on the edge of his mattress at 2 in the morning, too exhausted to walk to the practice hall, but too restless to sleep. He ate what was cheap and filling, wore the same coat through 3 winters, and told himself, on the coldest nights, that talent alone would eventually be enough to carry him the rest of the way. He did not yet know how rarely that turned out to be true for young men without money standing behind them. One winter evening, his delivery route brought him to the ballroom of a downtown hotel, where a 9-foot concert grand needed positioning before a private event the following night. The room was empty, the chandeliers dimmed, the other movers gone home for supper. Owen, alone with an instrument he was not supposed to touch, lifted the fallboard and let himself play for exactly 4 minutes, the only indulgence he allowed himself most weeks. He did not know a man was listening from the shadowed doorway until the piece ended and a voice, low and unhurried, told him not to stop on his account. Reginald Ashcroft had been waiting for a late business dinner in the adjoining room, and something in Owen's playing had pulled him away from his own guests entirely. Rather than reprimand the young mover for touching hotel property, Reginald sat down across the room and listened until Owen finished the entire piece. What followed was not friendship in any conventional sense, because Reginald did not know how to offer friendship without a transaction attached to it. He quietly settled the remainder of Owen's tuition through the conservatory's financial office, insisting his name never be attached to the gift, and began inviting the young man to the estate on evenings when the house was otherwise empty of guests. They rarely spoke about business. They spoke about music, about the architecture of a well-built chord, about the particular loneliness of a man who had built an empire out of steel and shipping contracts, and had almost nothing left over for the people who actually lived inside his house. It was during one of those evenings that Owen first realized Reginald was composing something of his own. The old man worked in fragments, humming a phrase, striking a few notes, scratching something onto a scrap of paper before crumpling it and starting again. Owen eventually learned the piece was intended for Vivienne, who had recently stormed out of the house after a bitter argument with her father over decisions she felt he made without ever once asking what she wanted. Reginald was not a man who apologized in sentences. He built things instead, bridges and buildings and, eventually, this quiet, unfinished melody, hoping it might say what decades of silence between them never could. He wanted his daughter to understand that no matter how far she traveled from this house, no matter how many years passed between her visits, the house and the man inside it would still be waiting. The composition was never completed. Reginald suffered a stroke before he could commit the final passage to paper, and Owen learned of it only after arriving at the hospital wing, still smelling of the shop where he now worked evenings to help pay rent. Conrad intercepted him in the corridor outside intensive care, his voice smooth and final, informing Owen that Reginald had no interest in seeing a struggling student cling to a family that was not his own during such a private crisis. Owen, exhausted and unsure of his place in a world this wealthy, believed him and turned around and never went back. Not long after, Owen's own life folded inward around a different kind of grief. His wife fell ill with a condition that stole first her strength and then, slowly, everything else, and Owen made the only choice that felt possible to him. He stepped away from the stage entirely, away from competitions and recital halls, and spent every waking hour by her side until the day there was nothing left to do but grieve. He rebuilt himself afterward as a piano technician instead of a performer, choosing work that let him stay close to music without demanding the spotlight he no longer had any appetite for. He never once used his brief, fragile connection to Reginald Ashcroft to open a door for himself, not even when opportunities were thin and money was thinner. Back in the present, standing at the window with her arms crossed tightly against her ribs, Vivienne absorbed all of this in fragments, still unwilling to fully believe a man she had met an hour ago. But Conrad's silence, his refusal to meet her eyes, his sudden interest in checking his phone rather than defending himself, planted a small, cold seed of doubt that had nothing to do with Owen at all. Eleanor found a quiet moment to approach Vivienne near the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. She told her that in the final months, before the stroke that eventually claimed him, Reginald had asked about a young man named Owen Callahan more than once, always late at night, always when he thought no one else was listening closely enough to remember. The old music room had been locked for years, its brass key kept in a drawer no one had opened since the funeral. Eleanor led Vivienne and Owen down a narrow corridor lined with faded photographs, past a grandfather clock that had stopped keeping time the same week Reginald died, until they reached a door with paint slightly darker than the walls around it, as though the room itself had been trying to disappear. Inside, dust hung suspended in shafts of afternoon light. Unfinished manuscripts lay scattered across a writing desk, their edges curled with age. Photographs of a much younger Vivian, gap-toothed and laughing on a swing set, sat propped against stacks of sheet music no one had touched in years. In the corner stood a wooden cabinet with a small brass lock shaped like a treble clef, an odd flourish for a man who rarely indulged in whimsy. Owen recognized the symbol immediately. It matched the engraving on a metronome Reginald had once given him as a parting gift, an old brass device he had kept in his tool bag through every apartment, every move, every year since. He retrieved it now, turning it over in his palms, and found, tucked beneath its weighted pendulum, a small key that had clearly been hidden there deliberately, waiting for someone who knew where to look. The key fit the cabinet's lock perfectly, proving beyond any argument that Reginald himself had intended for Owen to have access to this room, this cabinet, whatever secrets it still contained. But when the door swung open, the most important shelf inside sat empty, marked only by a rectangular outline in the dust where a folder had clearly rested until very recently. Conrad, who had followed them down the corridor uninvited, immediately suggested that Owen had removed the folder himself before staging this entire performance for sympathy or money. Owen knelt and studied the dust pattern closely, noting aloud that the disturbance looked only days old, far too recent to have been made by a man who had not set foot in this house in 18 years. Vivian asked, quietly, who else held keys to this room. Eleanor answered without hesitation that only 3 people did, herself, Vivian, and the estate's head of security, who reported directly to Conrad. The realization moved across Vivian's face slowly, like weather changing over open water, and for the first time since Owen had arrived, her suspicion turned away from the stranger with the tool bag and toward the man who had raised her since childhood as though he were her own father's shadow. Conrad urged them to abandon the search and refocus on the auction, warning that delays would cost the estate millions in penalties already written into the sale contracts. His urgency, sharp and slightly too loud, only deepened the unease settling over the room. This had stopped being a story about a forgotten piece of music. Someone with intimate access to this house was actively trying to erase whatever Reginald had left behind. As Owen turned to leave the cabinet, his eye caught a faint line of pencil script on the back of the music rack he had inspected earlier that morning, words so light they were nearly invisible, unless the afternoon sun struck the wood at just the right angle. 4 notes opened the door. The message read, "The final chord will call Harrow." Conrad wasted no time turning the situation to his advantage, summoning an emergency meeting of the Ashcroft Holdings Board directly inside the mansion's private conference room by early afternoon. Lawyers and senior executives filed in, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open skepticism, as Conrad positioned Owen at the center of the room like an exhibit rather than a guest. He painted Owen as a struggling single father, drowning in debt, who had somehow learned enough private family history to construct an elaborate scheme designed to extract sympathy and cash from a grieving heiress. It was a narrative built for maximum humiliation, and Conrad delivered it with the practiced smoothness of a man who had spent decades convincing rooms full of powerful people to believe whatever served him best. He produced a check, considerable in size, and slid it across the table toward Owen, along with a single-page agreement stating that the entire story about the melody was fabricated and that Owen would leave the property immediately and never contact the family again. It was meant to be an ending. Owen tore the check cleanly in half without raising his voice, informing the room that he had not come for money and would not sell the memory of a man who once believed in him when almost no one else did. The gesture rippled through the room in ways Conrad had not anticipated. Several board members who had walked in, prepared to dismiss Owen entirely, now exchanged uncertain glances, recalculating what kind of man tears up a check that size without a flicker of hesitation. Vivian, still composed on the surface, pressed Conrad on something that had been nagging at her since the hallway outside the hospital wing was mentioned. She asked how he had known Owen had once tried to visit her father there, since Conrad had insisted only minutes earlier that he had never laid eyes on this man before today. Conrad stumbled, claiming he must have reviewed old security logs, though his explanation arrived a beat too late to sound convincing. Owen offered a proposal into the tense silence that followed. He asked to be allowed to play the complete piece publicly at the following evening's auction gala. If Vivian heard nothing in it, recognized nothing, felt nothing, he would leave quietly and never speak the Ashcroft name again. Conrad objected with an intensity that seemed wildly disproportionate to a simple piano performance, and that overreaction alone convinced Vivian to accept the terms, if only to discover exactly what her uncle was so afraid the music might reveal. Within hours of the meeting adjourning, Conrad had quietly instructed the estate's moving crew to remove the Steinway from the premises before dawn, citing a private buyer overseas who had supposedly agreed to an expedited, confidential sale that bypassed the auction entirely. Owen, unable to sleep in the guest cottage where Eleanor had insisted he stay for the night, wandered toward the grand hall sometime after midnight and found two unfamiliar men attempting to lift the piano's massive frame using straps that were clearly rated for far less weight than the instrument demanded. He intervened immediately, not out of suspicion at first, but out of genuine alarm that the century-old soundboard was about to be cracked beyond repair by careless hands. Conrad appeared moments later, fully dressed despite the hour, and announced coolly that the piano had already been sold privately to a foreign collector, and that its removal was simply business proceeding on schedule. Eleanor, alerted by the commotion, called for Vivienne, who arrived in a robe with her hair still loose, fury replacing whatever sleep had remained in her eyes, when she saw the transfer paperwork bearing a signature that was unmistakably not her own. Conrad tried to explain the forgery away as an act of protection, insisting he had only been trying to shield the family's reputation from what he called an embarrassing, emotionally manipulative spectacle. Owen, kneeling beside the piano to inspect the damage from the rushed lifting, discovered something wedged deep beneath the felt lining of the pedal mechanism, a thin strip of paper that had clearly been hidden there for years, bearing Reginald's unmistakable handwriting, and beside it, the name of a lawyer neither Owen nor Vivian had heard mentioned in this house before that night. The strip contained no legal language at all, only a single handwritten line. The one who remembers the ending will know what he needs to hear. Owen dialed the number scrawled beside the lawyer's name without hesitation, and when a groggy voice answered, he simply played the 4 opening notes into the receiver and waited. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Owen wondered if the call had dropped entirely. Then the voice, now fully awake and considerably more formal, instructed everyone in the room not to move the piano another inch. Miles Harrow explained that Reginald had left a sealed envelope with him years earlier, with explicit instructions that it could only be opened once someone played that exact musical phrase to him directly, and that person had to be Owen Callahan by name. Conrad lunged for the phone, insisting Miles had retired years ago and no longer held any legal authority over estate matters. But Miles calmly informed the room he was already in his car, and that a representative from probate court would be joining him within the hour. In the chaos that followed, Conrad exercised his emergency authority as acting chief executive to suspend Vivienne from several key operational decisions, framing her judgment as compromised by what he called an unstable emotional state. It was only then, standing in the cold grand hall with the piano half suspended in canvas straps, that Vivian finally understood the true shape of what was happening around her. The auction had never simply been about selling a house full of memories. It had always been the mechanism by which Conrad intended to seize full and permanent control of Ashcroft Holdings for himself. The gala proceeded as scheduled the following evening, filling the grand hall with hundreds of guests, investors, and journalists eager to witness the final dispersal of one of the city's most storied fortunes. Conrad intended to use the public setting as a stage of his own, hoping a large enough audience might finally convince the board that Vivienne's judgment had become too fragile to trust with the company's future. He stood before the crowd and announced, with practiced gravity, that the man near the piano was an impostor who had been formally banned from the property, insisting loudly that a repairman could not be permitted to rewrite the history of a family as storied as the Ashcrofts. Vivienne stood at the edge of the room facing an impossible choice: protect her carefully constructed image by sending Owen away, or risk everything she had built to finally hear the truth her father had left behind. She walked to the small stage without another word, overruled Conrad's order in front of the entire assembly, and asked that the piano's lid be lifted one final time. Owen sat down before hundreds of unfamiliar, doubtful faces and began to play the piece. Reginald had never lived long enough to name publicly. The opening passage arrived distant and severe, mirroring the guarded, difficult man Reginald had always presented to the world. Slowly the melody softened, opening into something gentler, evoking small footsteps down a long hallway, a closed bedroom door, and a father standing quietly on the other side of it, too proud and too frightened to knock. Vivienne felt every childhood memory rise at once, unbidden, undeniable. She understood, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, that her father had never been indifferent to her at all. He had simply never learned how to close the distance he himself had created, choosing silence instead of the harder, braver work of speaking plainly. She remembered, with sudden and startling clarity, standing outside his study on the night before she left for college, her hand raised to knock and then lowered again without ever making contact with the door. She had assumed, back then, that his silence meant indifference, that a man so comfortable commanding boardrooms simply had nothing left over for his own daughter. Listening to the melody now, she understood it had never been indifference at all, only a fear so large it had swallowed every word he might have said. The guests around her had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that only settles over a room when something true is happening in front of it. Somewhere near the back, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a folded napkin. Even the catering staff, usually trained to move invisibly through such gatherings, had paused near the kitchen doors to listen. Vivienne barely noticed any of them. Her entire awareness had narrowed to the sound rising from beneath Owen's hands and the small, aching space it was carving open inside her chest. As Owen approached what should have been the final measures, his hands slowed, then stopped entirely, hovering just above the keys. He turned to Vivienne and told her, gently, that Reginald had never intended this piece to be played by a single set of hands alone. Vivienne hesitated, admitting she had not touched a piano in nearly 20 years, the guilt and grief of her estrangement from music mirroring her estrangement from her father almost exactly. Conrad seized the opening instantly, declaring to the assembled guests that the entire performance was nothing more than a calculated act of emotional manipulation designed to sway a room full of shareholders. Owen did not push her. He simply continued playing the accompaniment slowly, patiently, leaving an open, unhurried space beside him on the bench, a door left ajar rather than forced. After a long moment that seemed to stretch the length of the entire hall, Vivienne crossed the floor and sat down beside him. Her first notes were tentative, uncertain, the fingers of someone recalling a language she had not spoken since childhood. But they landed unmistakably in perfect alignment with the phrase Owen was already playing, a harmony too precise to have been staged or coincidental. The room around them understood, almost as one collective breath, that they were witnessing something that could not have been rehearsed. The two melodic lines wound together at last, one representing a father who had waited far too long, the other a daughter who had finally come home. As the final chord rang out and dissolved into the vaulted ceiling above them, Miles Harrow entered through the Grand Hall's tall doors, a sealed envelope held carefully in both hands. Inside was a letter addressed to Vivienne, the original handwritten score of the composition itself, and a legal codicil granting voting authority over Ashcroft Holdings. Reginald had written that he originally intended to hand full operational control to his brother until he discovered, quietly and with considerable heartbreak, that Conrad had been diverting funds from the company's employee welfare trust for years. He had left ultimate control with his daughter instead, but Conrad had spent months intercepting the law firm's official notices and pushing forward the sale of the estate before that codicil could ever come to light. Conrad, his composure finally cracking in front of the very board members he had spent years cultivating, insisted the documents were fraudulent. But Miles produced notarized certifications, matching bank records, and a chain of correspondence bearing Conrad's own signature at every step. Vivienne turned to face her uncle in front of the entire gathered board, her voice steady despite everything trembling beneath it. "Is there anyone else?" she asked. "You'd like to call an imposter tonight." The board suspended Conrad from his position as chief executive within days, launching an independent financial review into years of questionable transfers. There was no dramatic arrest, no raised voices in handcuffs, only the quiet, methodical unraveling of a man's influence as, one by one, the very people who had once deferred to him withdrew their support entirely. Vivienne canceled the sale of the estate outright and ordered a full review of every transaction Conrad had authorized during his tenure. She also found Owen the following morning near the guest cottage and offered him something she had never once offered anyone in her adult life, a sincere apology, admitting she had judged him solely by his clothing and his profession the moment he walked through her front door. Owen did not use the moment to humiliate her, though he would have been entitled to. He told her, simply, that her father had made the very same mistake, that pride had kept a brilliant, powerful man from ever admitting he needed the people around him, and that the cost of that pride had rippled through generations longer than it needed to. Vivienne read her father's letter alone that night in the library, where he used to sit for hours after her mother passed away. Reginald confessed, in handwriting that grew shakier toward the final lines, that he had built an entire empire out of steel contracts and shipping lanes, yet had never once found the courage to knock on his own daughter's bedroom door and simply say he was sorry. For the first time, Vivienne understood the melody was never an excuse. It was a confession, written in the only language her father had ever fully trusted himself to speak honestly. Miles delivered a second, private letter to Owen the following week. In it, Reginald thanked him for carrying the ending safely for so many years and apologized for failing to protect him from Conrad's interference on the worst night of both their lives. Tucked inside the same envelope was an offer, one Owen had not expected, inviting him to become the founding director of a new music scholarship program established in the Ashcroft family name. Owen did not accept immediately. He wanted to be certain, beyond any doubt, that he was being invited because of his own worth and not simply out of guilt or obligation toward a dead man's memory. When he finally raised the question aloud to Vivienne, her answer surprised him. She told him she was not offering him a job at all. She was asking him to help her finish building the very thing her father had never lived long enough to complete. 6 months later, the Ashcroft estate reopened its doors not as a private residence, but as a conservatory and mentorship center for young musicians who might otherwise never have access to an instrument, let alone an education. The 1928 Steinway still stood in the Grand Hall, though it was no longer draped in protective cloth or treated as an untouchable relic. It had been fully restored under Owen's careful supervision. Its voice returned in full for the first time in decades. Owen accepted the role of artistic director, though he insisted on keeping his small repair workshop attached to the property, unwilling to let a title change the fundamental nature of who he was. His daughter appeared briefly at the opening ceremony, just long enough to see her father standing proudly in a room he once would have entered only through the service door, proof that his quiet, steady choices over the years had built something lasting for her as well. Conrad was formally removed from the company following the conclusion of the financial investigation. The story did not linger on punishment for its own sake, only on the simple, undeniable truth that he had ultimately lost the very thing he had always wanted most, the right to speak the Ashcroft name as though it belonged to him. Vivienne's leadership shifted gradually in the months that followed. She remained exacting and formidable in the boardroom, but she no longer measured a person's worth by the fabric of their clothing or the balance of their bank account. She had learned, through the hardest possible lesson, that dignity rarely announces itself with wealth. She kept her father's letter folded inside her desk drawer, not out of sentiment alone, but as a reminder of the cost of silence left unspoken for too long. On difficult days, when the instinct to retreat behind formality and distance rose up in her the way it always had, she would open the drawer, read the familiar, trembling handwriting once more, and choose to speak plainly instead. It was a small discipline, but it changed the shape of every relationship she had left. Eleanor stayed on at the estate long after the transformation was complete, no longer polishing silver for guests who never came, but instead greeting the young musicians who arrived each week for lessons, remembering each of their names within days the way she had once remembered every detail of the family she had served for so long. She liked to say, to anyone who would listen, that the house finally sounded the way it was always meant to. On the evening of the opening ceremony, Owen prepared to play Reginald's composition once more for the assembled guests. He turned to Vivienne beside him and asked, quietly, whether she was ready to finish the second half of the piece herself. Vivienne sat down beside him without hesitation this time. Before either of them touched a single key, she looked toward the piano that had once been locked away behind velvet rope and unspoken grief, and spoke softly enough that only Owen could hear her. "My father used to think this house was waiting for me to come home," she said. "But maybe it was only ever waiting for someone brave enough to make it sing again." Owen lowered his hands and played the first 4 notes. This time, no one in the room asked him to stop.